Berwick's fine position, with the sea on one side and the river on the other, gives it the feeling of being an island. But its location, so near to the Scottish border, has brought turbulence as well as prosperity. Berwick is the most northerly town in England, but it was not forever thus. Indeed, it frequently became the most southerly town on the east coast of Scotland. These sturdy defensive walls, which run right around the perimeter of the town, followed more than 200 years of warfare, during which Berwick changed hands between the Scots and the English no less than 13 times. It's now very firmly a part of England, yet the local football team, Berwick Rangers, play in the Scottish League. Generations of soldiers who garrisoned Berwick gradually wore out their welcome among the people on whom they were billeted. So, at the beginning of the 18th century, barracks were built to house them, and they remain among the most notable Georgian buildings in this part of England. The army finally left in 1963, presumably by then feeling secure from Scottish invasion, and the buildings became home to 3 museums, one of which houses part of the famous Burrell collection. Sir William Burrell was a Glasgow shipping magnate and a collector of fine art. He lived only 5 miles away, and in the 1940s donated some of the treasures from his collection to the Berwick Museum. Well, we'd be fortunate indeed if we were to see items of that quality here. But who knows? After all, it's the very essence of the Antiques Roadshow that as we begin our day, we have literally no idea at all what we're going to find. All I can say at this stage is that David Batty has already seen something he rather likes.
What immediately strikes me about them, well, there are 2 things. Firstly is that they are actually very precisely drawn. The painting is very, very carefully delineated. If you look at this border on here, it all works very well. Somebody's thought very carefully about those little scrolls. The whole balance of the design has been very carefully thought out. We've got on the shoulders here the 8 Buddhistic emblems.
Is that what it is?
That's what they are, yes. And those we see on many, many things. They even turn up as marks. We've got a 5-clawed dragon running round here and repeated on the cover. And he's amongst clouds, which is what these things are supposed to be. And there's the flaming pearl, the Buddhistic pearl of wisdom, which they are disputing or chasing.
Oh, is that what it is?
Right, so first we got rather nicely painted. And the second thing that strikes me immediately about it is this weird, smudgy, dirty brown-looking painting with traces here and there of red. I would like to just try something, because I've got a feeling that that is not contemporary colouring, and out comes the...
Disaster.
Yeah, that's it. Now, this is where the owner starts going, what's he going to do? We'll just see what happens if we find a bit of red here. It scrapes off, OK? And I wouldn't mind betting that this scrapes off as well. Look at that, comes straight off. This is somebody, I don't know when, in your family, brightening them up, probably a child, nothing to do with a wet afternoon. I want to do some painting. Well, paint that then. And off he goes, carefully painting in the clouds and the Buddhistic emblems. And that's cold painting, as we call it. That should come off. And you would then have pure blue and white, which is how they started out life.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Now, having said all that, this is the real joy. On the bottom, the mark. Now, of course, Chinese marks one simply cannot trust. They stuck any old mark on any old thing, and you've got to know the way the mark's painted and everything else, and tie it up with the shape and the painting to make sure you've got the real thing.
All comes together.
This is actually, yeah, exactly, this is what we call mark and period. Now, this is the mark of the Emperor Dao Guang. It's a seal mark. It says Ta Qing, which is Great Qing dynasty, Dao Guang, which is his name, Nian Qi, made in the reign of, and in seal characters rather than written. And this was made during his reign, therefore it is mark and period, and he reigned from 1821 to 1850. And that makes an enormous difference, because a pair of 19th century export ware blue and white jars and covers like this are worth a couple of £100. But because they're mark and period, and I believe that all this dirty colouring will come off, it's going to make an enormous difference to the price. And given the market's still a bit flat, they would still make £4,000 to £6,000 a pair. And it could be quite a bit more if you keep them for a while.
Is
Surprised?
that right? Yes, very much.
How long have you had
Yes,
it?
I've always loved it. Well, it was the seat that was beside my father's desk. And I loved it. I used to sit on it when I was a child and feel I was a queen, you know,
how
and
much?
king.
Well, yes, a
And
regal-looking
it was-
chair anywhere.
I just loved it, and eventually they said, look, you love that chair, you know, take it. And so I did.
Marvellous. Oh, very good.
And
What I
that-
like about it is, in fact, that slightly regal look to it.
Yes.
The Carolean period, after the Restoration, you had this sort of flamboyance.
Yes.
And with all these curves interspersed with straight lines, you get this wonderful, wonderful arm, which is almost a humanoid.
Yes,
It's
what we
lovely.
always thought.
And then, of course, you come down, you've got turn sections, which have to be rectangular at various points to take the junction of the stretchers. And then, right at the bottom, you've got a little curled foot. It's rather like a little knuckle, you know, as
Yes.
if you've done that. It's called a Braganza Foot, and it simply was an influence from Spain after Catherine of Braganza, the Infanta of Spain, who married Charles II.
Yes.
Now, the one thing is, when it started life, it wasn't upholstered. It should have two stretchers down the centre here and probably a cane panel.
Yes.
Now, there. There, you can feel here. Now, do you feel that?
Oh,
There's a
yes.
curly stretcher inside there.
Do you know, I've never noticed that.
Right. And it comes up to here, down the centre, and then curls away, following this outline, across here. From that point, those 2 points
Yes.
there would have been 2 bars, 2 uprights, and then a cane panel, and then, again, you've got a very fancy line in here. Look at this. Wonderful. You see? And that would all be carved and moulded. Now, imagine how lovely that would look.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it looks fine now.
Yes,
You
but-
can't do anything about it. But imagine how elegant with just a cane panel and, of course, a cane seat,
Yes.
not upholstered. So this was done, in the 20s, I should think, which was when a lot of them were done. But it's wonderful to see such a pretty chair, an important-looking chair, this lovely shape, original paintwork, 1675, 1680. Lovely. Not a big money item, you
No.
know. But a chair today that would probably cost you, £1,800, £2,000 to replace it, even in this state. But it's lovely, wonderful.
Thank you.
Such a good character.
Oh, isn't that splendid?
There you go.
What I love is the waterfall.
That's
Waterfall with
attractive,
a
isn't it?
twisted glass waterfall, which is in here, shown up in the pond, and the birds. How many movements? It looks as though it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 movements
6 movements. The only one that doesn't move is the bird by the bath.
by the path. Well, it's not English. You probably know that. Well,
It was purchased by an uncle of mine in Brighton in 1939.
and have you had anything done to it? Was it working well?
Yes, it's always worked well. We had it refurbished in the 1970s by a gentleman in Edinburgh.
When you say refurbished, you didn't have any feathers put on the birds or anything?
No, just I think really the mechanism.
Yes, the mechanism was
Yes.
a bit sticky.
Yes, yes.
But the lovely thing about this is, and I particularly like these bird automatons because they're usually by Bontemps, Blaise Bontemps, who was a French automaton maker. And he was born in 1814.
Yes.
And he became very well known in 1854. He started a shop in Paris.
Yes, yes.
And although this isn't as early as that, the box, the early ones would have been ormolu or gilt metal cages. And this is probably a 1910 example.
Yes.
But it's a very sophisticated example, because some of them only had one bird in them. And this would probably have been made by his son, Charles, who took over when Blaise stopped in the 80s. And they're very collectible. And I would say that on a good day, we could see this making somewhere in the region of £3,500 to £5,000. And so for insurance, we would be talking about probably 6,000 or 7,000. Because it's difficult to find them with all this many birds. And they're in such good condition.
Right, Polish silver. Polish silver, yes, nice. you got another one of these?
No, I've
Just
just
the
one.
single one.
Has it got a name?
Thing.
Thing.
Yes,
Yeah,
thing.
it looks like a thing, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's hardly the sort of thing you could christen, really.
Today's legislation would say that probably you could only sell that to a school or a college. And that probably it would have to be registered because the import and export of this type of creature and the general well-being of reptiles is becoming more and more important. So you can't replace it.
No.
I can't buy another one.
No.
So
No, I wouldn't.
You know,
As I
it
say,
could be-
I wouldn't part with it anyway. It's got a strange fascination. It grows
it's got a
on you.
very morbid sense of fascination, yes.
It is super with this plum-coloured velvet here. The depth of the glass beads is 3 or 4 or 5 deep, and now very often you only get a single strand of bead. It really would keep a teapot warm for hours. I mean, it's so well insulated, it's remarkable. It's a lovely piece. I think value-wise, it's good enough to make 80, 100, maybe 120 pounds. And that is far in excess of many pieces of Berlin bead.
You know what?
No idea.
Oh, that one, yeah. Yeah, well, that's the Japanese one. Yeah. Normal clothes there, right. Any more? Goodness me. Is there anything left on your shelves at home?
Why did you pick this?
I don't know, I just fell in love with it.
So he was swapped for a quilt?
Yes.
And did you know anything about him? I mean, you saw it was on the back.
Yes.
It was made by Royal Doulton.
But not at the time. I didn't know that at the time.
You didn't know at the time. So you picked it purely because you liked it?
Yes.
Right. He may not keep you warm in the same way the quilt does, but he has other virtues. This is a Jester wall mask.
Yes.
It was introduced by Royal Doulton in 1937, and the current market price for this piece is, what do you think?
£100.
It's about £150. So you did a very good swap for a quilt. As I say, he may not warm you, but he will pay the heating bills for some time to come.
Well, you obviously like Worcester porcelain, don't you? You've collected these over years.
Many years.
This is quite genuine Worcester. Very pretty little coffee cup from a tea set. Has the genuine Worcester mark of the square underneath the bottom, and it's as right as rain, made about 1770. And a pretty little coffee cup. Worth just on its own without saucer. You haven't got saucer?
No, I haven't got
No, it's worth around about 60, 80 pounds. But a pretty little piece. This one, of course, although it looks very like Worcester, this little ink set is not.
No, I suspect it not.
You suspect, well, that's a relief. It's always terrible to tell someone that their swan is a goose, but this is an earthenware body, a very typical earthenware, not porcelain at all, not translucent. So although it looks desperately like Worcester, it is made by, I think, a firm called Booths of Tunstall in Stoke-on-Trent. Very similar in quality, not perhaps as fine, but cover doesn't fit terribly well, does it? But made, I suppose, 100 years later than the coffee cup.
Yes,
1870,
yes,
something
yes,
like that.
yes.
But still, it's jolly nice. How much did you pay for that?
About 30 shillings. £1.50. £1.50.
£1.50. I suppose it was very nice. I suppose, well, nowadays, a couple of £100. It's very nice, even though it's not Worcester, it's a couple of £100. If it had been Worcester, many thousands of pounds. So it makes quite a difference.
Yes.
And then these two super pots, both pierced, from the Granger factory in Worcester. Grangers were a rival to the main Worcester factory, eventually absorbed into them. And one of their great specialities were these beautiful pierced vases on an ivory glazed Parian body, which is very, very beautiful, isn't it? This one is more dull ground than this one. It's more glazed, but very beautiful. The piercing, this lovely piercing at the top, done by a man called, who specialised in this particular thing at the Granger factory. His name was Alfred Barry.
Yes.
So he would have done this one and this big pot. But unfortunately, you've taken the cover to
Just to hold
the
it
pot.
steady.
To hold it steady while bringing it. If I could plead with you, never, never to use sticky tape over gold. One sees it sometimes in auctions, a label is put over it, and as you lift it off, the beautiful gold is lifted off as well. This little piece here, we're going to try like desperately hard to get it off, but it's going to lift little tiny flakes of gold off as one does it. The only thing I can suggest is perhaps later you put it into, soak it into water, and hope that it will lift off. I'm afraid you have done a lot of damage to the pot. You are terribly naughty. I'm going to threaten you with the with my new society, which is called the RSPCP, the Royal Society of the Prevention of Cruelty to Porcelain.
And I'm number one member.
You're number one, and they're going to call on you tomorrow. But you have done a bit of damage, regrettably. But they're still super pots. I suppose this pot here is worth something like about £600–700. It's very beautiful. This one here, if the gold hadn't been damaged, would have been worth near the £1,000 bracket. A little bit less now because of the gold damage, because no matter how careful you are, you're going to lift a bit off. But I think it's still a super pot.
Now, we have here a very, very nice pair of enamel plaques. Can you tell me who they show?
Yes, there's Sebastian Garrard, who was a partner with his brother Robert II, the Crown Jewellers.
Yes.
And his wife. He's my great-great-great-uncle.
Right, so you are or were a Garrard?
Yes, my mother was.
Your mother was a Garrard. I mean, that is a perfect provenance.
Yes.
They've come straight down through the family.
Yes.
And so even if we didn't know who Garrard was, which of course we obviously do as the Crown Jeweller, you'd have been able to tell us. They're in the original box, which is marked Garrard. The artist concerned was a man called John Simpson. Now, do you know anything about him?
Not at all. We haven't been able to find anything at all about him.
Right. He was born in 1811 and he lived until 1884, so he spanned much of the 19th century. He was born in Derby and he was trained in Derby as a porcelain painter. So although these are enamels on a metal base, on gold, his real training in life was as a porcelain painter. In 1837, he moved from Derby to Minton, which many artists did at that time. Minton was a rising factory, Derby a sinking one, and so they were simply following a rising star. And to me, the interesting part of the story is when he left Minton in 1847, he went to join the Government School of Art, the School of Design, set up in Marlborough House in London, and he was in charge of the enamel painting department. So when he painted these, and I think they're dated on the back, 1851, he was at that point the official government teacher of enamel painting. And so, sliding down. And so he fits very much into the whole pattern of the Victorian development of the decorative arts. Now, do you have any idea of the value of these?
Well, when I purchased them from Garrard's, I paid $1,500.
Right, and how long ago was that?
About 5–6 years ago.
Yes. Well, I think you did quite well. I mean, it wasn't the greatest bargain of the century.
No.
But you wouldn't expect that. It was a fair price for the time.
Yes.
Simpson is now, I think, more appreciated than he was then. I'd push it up towards 2,500–3,000 for insurance purposes.
Really?
Perhaps a bit less in terms of market value.
Yes.
So say 2,500, because they are so good of their type.
Well, this is a find, I must say, a collection of Darwin letters. Tell me about them. Who are they to?
They're to my grandfather in Portugal.
This is the William Tate here.
That's the William C. Tate who then wrote a book called On the Birds of Portugal.
Birds of Portugal, of course, yes, absolutely. Well, the first letter I see is dated 1869. Now, Darwin, as you know, was born in 1809, and so he was 60. The origin of the species had come out 10 years earlier in 1859, and so he was a very famous man by this time. And so your grandfather writes to Darwin, and he writes this wonderful letter. I thank you for your very obliging letter, and I'm pleased to hear you have been interested in my works. As you've been so kind as to offer me some notes, I shall be glad to receive any facts about which you feel quite positive. So Darwin was getting lots of correspondence from lots of people. Yes. Now he goes on here. Tell me about this. This is the bit about the Drosophilum.
Drosophilum lusitanica.
Yes. Now that is a carnivorous plant, isn't it?
Yes, that's a fly-catching plant.
A fly-catching plant.
He mentions it's a rare. It isn't at all that rare. It grows on sandy soil, and it's particular to Portugal.
Which is particular to Portugal, indeed.
Yes.
And then he signs it Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin signed in full. I mean, that's very nice indeed, with a little footnote at the bottom there. The second letter, he writes very excitedly, because he's asked him to send him one of these plants. Dear sir, your kindness is extraordinary. Great about the Drosophilum. And he writes 4 pages again saying how extremely excited he is. We then go on to April the 18th. All from Down House, Bromley, Kent, which is where he lived and where he died. A very fine house, now a museum. And he says, I'm not very well after a fall from my horse, so write to thank you for your obliging letter, etc., etc., etc. And he goes on, I haven't been able to go and see the plants in the greenhouses because I am far too weak. And so this is a rather sort of a short letter, just signed Charles Darwin. And finally, June the 1st, dear sir, I'm very much obliged for your kindness, and your grandfather had obviously said that he was in London and would love to come and see him. And he puts him off, and he says, I have so little strength that I shall not be able to examine your plants for a considerable time. You can send them if you please, etc., etc. And he signs it again, Charles Darwin. Now, is there anything about this collection of letters that seems odd to you?
No, I mean, I know he went through a period, he always thought he was very ill, and there was some, like, how ill he really was.
Yes, it's nothing extraordinary particularly, but you have 3 letters that are not autograph letters, and 1 that is an autograph letter. The unenthusiastic letters are all written by an amanuensis, probably his wife, who did a lot of writing for him. And this exciting letter, this one, is the one which is written in his crabby handwriting. You can read all the others easily. Yes. I could read all the others easily. This is the one I had to ponder over rather a lot. This is in his own handwriting. And this is the big one, the 4-page letter. Although it's not signed in full, that's the one that shines for me. In this one, he actually puts a little footnote there, which is in his own hand.
Yes,
which is quite a nice little item.
Nice item, yes.
But there we are. Now, Darwin is not unusual because he was a famous man for a very long time. As you know, he went on in his 20s, he was on the Voyage of the Beagle and wrote that book after that voyage. And so he was writing all his life, so his letters do come onto the market quite often.
Yes.
But I wonder if you've had these insured.
No, I have no idea.
Well, I think a very nice collection of 4 like that with good content about insectivorous plants. I mean, his book on insectivorous plants came out in 1875, so it was all, you know, all to do with the whole writing and all the rest of it. And the connection with your famous naturalist grandfather. I would say £5,000 to £7,000
for
the collection.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for bringing them along.
He's a very well-loved bear, but not of any great value. In fact, you can also feel he's been restuffed. It's very soft in his...
Yeah, it's like another.
Oh, there's been an operation down there at the back. Right.
You know, obviously he got a bit... when they took the growl out, they repacked it.
Right, because his head is still full of the original packing. That's something called Excelsior, which is like wood wool or wood straw. And inside it's kapok, which is a much softer fabric. But for all that, I think I can't tell you that he's going to be worth a lot of money. He's English rather than German, and his value would be really just a few pounds.
This lady has 165 chamber pots.
165 chamber pots? How many? Well, it's almost one for every day of the year.
It can't be any later, really, than 1874, and no earlier than 1866, and it looks like 67, 68. It's the sort of thing that was used in the Franco-Prussian War. And interestingly enough, the Germans got hold of a lot of them in the First World War, and they ground the backs down and shortened the blades off and used them on their own rifles because they were desperately short of arms.
But I love these little chamber pots, aren't they great? They got little inscriptions on them, don't they? I am the first call of the morning.
What is that one, sir? It says, hand it over to me, my dear.
This one got it's got Hitler in the bottom.
We've got Hitler and Mussolini. Now, the Hitler one is quite common.
Yes. I've never seen Mussolini. Oh, what a wonderful connection.
Yeah. Oh. What about Mussolini? Where did he come from?
I got them in the antique place in Salisbury. I think I paid 38 for one of them.
Gosh.
And about 25.
Yes.
25.
That is the rare one. Yes. And it says on the back, of course, we've got him on the run. Now, that was more terrible. Can't you say you're a real potty enthusiast?
Well, I bought it in
At auction in Glasgow, probably about 20 years ago, partly because I liked it and partly because of the subject.
I noticed actually from the back, there's this little label which says Mother and Children, Early English School. Do you have any particular idea who it might be by, or did you buy it with an attribution at all?
Well, it was attributed to Fuseli in the catalogue. I bought it and hoped that it was by Fuseli.
Yes. Well, I think you bought very well, because in my opinion, I think there's a very good chance it is by Fuseli. And he's a very, very interesting artist. I don't know whether you know anything about him at all, but he was born in Zurich, and therefore he's a Swiss artist. And he was born in 1741. He went to work in Rome for a bit in the 1770s. And there he was influenced by people like Michelangelo and the great old master of painters. And then after that, in 1779, he then came to England, where he settled. And Sir Joshua Reynolds was very impressed by his drawings and encouraged him to start painting. And towards the end of his career, in 1799, he then went to the Royal Academy, where he became Professor of Painting. And so he was a very, very influential figure on a lot of artists. But I think, just looking at the drawing now, the first thing is the subject matter. And the subject, I think, is probably charity. This is a very popular subject. And the composition is very much taken from the Italian Renaissance painters. I mean, you can see that he's been to Rome, and he's obviously looked at a lot of these artists, and the actual composition is very much out of that. As you can see, it's done in pen and ink, which is normal for Fuseli. But the nice thing is it has a bit of extra impetus in a way, in that it has this wash here. You see, this baby has a nice white wash on it, and with highlighting. And I think the highlighting looks as though it may be an oil painting, in oil paint, which is somewhat unusual. Can you tell me, did you pay a lot of money for this or not?
I don't remember exactly. I think it was about 60 or 70 pounds.
Yes. Well, I think you did pretty well, actually, because, in fact, Fuseli is a very topical artist at the moment, because fairly recently, the story goes, a man walked off the street into an auction house in London, and with 50 or 60 drawings by Fuseli that he bought 20 years ago. And he didn't know, I think he thought they were by Fuseli, but he didn't know if they had any value. Well, those 50 or 60 drawings made a total, I think, of £600,000 in a sale. So I think what you have here is, in my opinion, is probably going to be worth somewhere between £5,000 and £8,000, I would think. But I cannot stress to you how, I mean, I think it's probably the most interesting thing I've seen on the ROADSHOw since I've been on it, and it's a really beautiful drawing.
Thank you very much indeed.
This is a very grand and imposing silver punch bowl of the late Georgian period. Does it stand on your dining room table or sideboard?
No, I actually keep it in the bank. Yeah.
Well, it has a few points about it that you wouldn't expect to see on a Georgian punch bowl of this period. Firstly, if we look at the main hallmarks, which are on the body here, we see it has the maker's mark of John Bridge. And you may notice that those marks were rubbed and rather polished out. And this is because, again, round the front here, all the way around the front, and on the other side as well, it's had an inscription which has been polished out. And in some places, the silver is so thin, you can actually push it in and out with your finger. The most curious thing about it, though, is that the rim, which is made in a separate part, and you can actually see this line coming all the way around the top, is made by a different maker. And this has the maker's mark of Robert Garrard stamped quite prominently here. Not a full set of marks, they're called part marks or additions marks. This mark must have been put on in about 1835, 1836, around about that time. If we also turn it up and look in the base, we can see there's another maker's mark here, R.G. Robert Garrard. Mm-hmm. And again, this was put on round about 1835, again, William IV's head. So what started off life as a much plainer bowl has been added to some years later and made into a much more elaborate looking bowl. Round this side, we have a nicely engraved coat of arms, which are contemporary with the date of this rim. So they've been put on, again, around about 1836, 37 maybe. Has it been in your family long?
Yes, it was actually my auntie's bowl, and she left it to me when she died.
All right. Well, because this is not in its original state, its value is considerably less than what it would have been had it been in absolutely perfect. A good Georgian bowl by a good late Georgian maker, and especially one of Bridges' standards, would easily make £10,000–15,000 at auction, maybe more. But because it has been tampered with, and because the silver is very thin in places, I would expect it only to make about £3,000 to £5,000 at auction, although one would insure it for somewhat more.
I want to know if it's true, Lally.
Ah, yes, well, they will give you chapter and verse on that.
Good.
This is right, 18th century.
18th century wood.
Yeah, so I would say we're right. Damaged very badly around the edge, so...
Bubbling isn't particularly good.
No. And it doesn't fetch as much as one imagines it ought to do, even Watford does it.
I mean, if in good condition, it would be...
In good condition, 400 or 500.
But as it is, about
150.
Yes.
I'd go along with that.
We agree, late 18th century.
Yes, late 18th century.
Thank you.
And definitely Watford.
What's so lovely about this is the condition of it, because it is early. I mean, we're talking about 1825. It's a Regency picture. And it's got all the stitches that you would wish. It's got all this lovely embroidery around the edge. It's got chenille work here. This, you probably know, is called forbidden stitch. It's forbidden because it made people go blind. Putting in these tiny little knots. And the colours are wonderful, because usually what goes first is the reds, and you've still got quite a bit of red in there. And the blues are very good. Where you have lost it is in the thistles. You don't have any red in that thistle. I think that's lost it more than the inside. And they used to be sold in pairs and made in pairs, but even on its own, I can see that in a shop being sold for somewhere around £500.
Oh, we got two. Oh, £200. So look after the
What about this one then, Henry?
Well, that's
lovely Delftware plate, isn't it? Have you had this long?
Yes, I've had it about 40 years.
Do you mind me asking you how much you paid for it 40 years ago?
Oh, I should think about 10 shillings.
10 shillings. That's not bad. It's
And
matured a little, hasn't it, Henry?
I had
other plates with it.
Yeah.
Well, it's now worth something in well over £200. 250 at least. You might be asked to pay more than that if you were to buy it in a shop as you did 40 years ago.
Not
Lovely.
bad.
Not bad. You've got a good eye.
I got it off a dust cart.
A dust cart?
I did.
Well, then you've got to tell me the rest of the story.
Well, what happened is when I was first married, I lived in a flat in Croydon.
Right.
And one day, the old lady who was living next door to us came and knocked on the door and asked my husband if he would help the dustman down with this old desk, because she didn't think they would take it otherwise. And, well, we were living out of orange boxes at the time, so I thought, well, that'll hold papers. That's it.
How long ago was that?
Well, my son would have been about 2, so he's about 34 now, so that's, what, 32 years ago?
Still unbelievable. What a wonderful story. Well, it's George II, late George I period desk.
It is.
Absolutely.
It really is.
Yes. I'm going to look at a drawer. First off, well, yes, it's 1730, 1740.
Gracious.
Little oval tops to the drawer linings. Always a good sign on an early 18th century piece of drawer furniture. And then we look inside, all pine, which is good.
Yes.
For a walnut veneer, should be on pine. Gosh, what a treasure. That is a good one.
That's incredible.
Lovely colour. Everything's nice about it. Cross-banded edge, nice figured walnut. I think the only serious
thing that's happened to it is at some time...
Yes.
It's been re-veneered. The top has been re-veneered. That quarter veneer...
Not in my time,
Probably
that's
100
for
years
sure.
ago. Probably 100 years ago.
Yes.
Absolutely. I would think when those handles were put on and some restoration was done to it, and I should think that was when it was done, simply because of deterioration.
Yes.
Which would detract certainly from the value, again, to a collector. But a little desk like that, a little George I, early George II Neho desk, walnut veneered, lovely handles, really. Although only 4 feet, sometimes they had 2 extra in the middle.
Yes.
Nevertheless, still a good example of the period. 6,500.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, definitely. Oh,
Lovely thing.
But
what
well,
a joy.
that's how exciting.
That's
lovely. I think I'd better take up totting as an occupation.
And I'll come with you.
Yes, I think that's an excellent idea.
Thank you so much.
There's a little poem on the front here which says, once I was the commandant of Copenhagen and ruled this little place with just a glance. Now I'm just a little drip, just a little drip, and dance to your command, even on my head. Well, it's a strange little poem, but if we wind him up, I think we'll see that he does just that. Does he work?
Yeah, never had dancing with his hair, right?
There he is. He's doing a sort of military gait. And I think, actually, if we put him on his head, he does. He dances on his head, too. There's a fascinating story about this particular toy because it's based on a historical event. And the toy itself is called the Captain of Copenhagen, who in 1906, whilst the town of Copenhagen was under military rule for some reason, went to the treasury and absconded with the whole town's money. So it was a very famous scandal, if you like. And this was in 1906, and within a few weeks of that event taking place, Lehman, the company that made this toy, very cleverly converted one of their toys to represent this particular man. And this toy is much better known without the greatcoat on and with a different hat as the Lehman Sailor. And they added a moustache to give him a sort of more military look, and they gave him grey hair. What have we got here as far as identification is concerned? Oh, well, now that is riveting. Look at this. You've got here the patent date of May 1903. It just gives some more backing to my theory that they used the sailor, because this event didn't happen till 1906. And here on the bottom, we see the 1903 date, which relates to the sailor. So we know that that once was a sailor. He's in very good condition. Look at his epaulets here. Look at his buttons. And this, I love this sword. Let me just get to his sword again, because that's really frightfully swish. Look at that. And look, underneath, the navy blue that the sailor originally is. So it's all sort of coming together, isn't it? So he's by a good maker. He's really in very good condition. At the back here, there's the key. That also says Lehman on it. And in his original box like that, and in very good condition, so often the sword is missing, I would say he's going to be worth around about £500. So, he is. You're going to look after him now?
Yeah. Put him back in his box again.
For me, Arthur Melville is one of the great unsung heroes of modern watercolour painting. I mean, we're looking here at the work of a genius work of a young 23-year-old. He was studied at Glasgow School of Art. At 17, he travelled to France and studied under Plastin Lepage, producing some extraordinary works, and then he travelled south. And here he is in Cairo, aged 23, with this extraordinary, almost uncontrolled dapple technique, which is completely controlled, and describing the coolness of the covered bazaar in contrast to the bright light outside. We see here in this area the technique he became famous for, with both here and here the dappled washes almost punched on but painted onto a wet white paper. Very difficult, but so beautifully done that we get the dappled light coming in on the body of the melon cellar. We get here in the washes here, the smoke from the hookah, the steam from the hookah pipe. And then in contrast, these wonderful bright figures, almost hazy in the bright sunshine outside. This is very exciting. It's exciting because it's Melville. I don't think this picture's been seen before, has it?
No, it hasn't. No,
It's just been in the family?
Been in the family for, I should think, probably 50 years at least, or more. Well, it's certainly been in the family a long time, yes.
It's wonderful to discover a new Melville,
yes.
A young Melville, an Orientalist Melville, with everything we want. I feel very excited about it, and I think I would value it at somewhere between £18,000 and £25,000.
You don't really mean that, do you?
Absolutely. I think it's a wonderful thing.
In 18 and 25? My goodness me, that does surprise me. Really? Sure.
Well, I was wondering at the beginning of the programme, you may remember, whether we'd see anything of the quality of Sir William Burrell's collection during our day here in Berwick, and indeed we did. There were at least half a dozen things that we've seen during the course of the day that I'm sure Sir William would have been indeed proud to own. And we end with a fitting memento of a local heroine, Grace Darling, and she really was one of the great sort of popular characters of the early Victorian era, Henry,
Victorian
wasn't it?
heroine, yes. Her father was lighthouse keeper on the Longston Lighthouse, just off the Farne Islands from here, and in one great storm, she rowed to rescue the Forfarshire, the crew and the captain, in tremendous seas. I mean, a young girl in her 20s, it was just incredible to believe it.
There's a very good line drawing here of the heroic event.
Oh, yes.
And there were songs written about her, weren't there?
Yes.
And there were poems written about her.
And pieces of porcelain, everything made about her.
Yes.
But we've had come into the place a descendant of her, who's brought this signed affidavit, which is marvellous, with her brooch.
How wonderful.
Attested before a court in Berwick-Upon-Tweed here, and it's very attractive indeed.
It's been a very good day altogether, Henry, hasn't it?
It's been wonderful, absolutely marvellous.
And let's hope we have such a good time next week when we're in South Devon, my old stamping ground. So as you might imagine, I'm much looking forward to that. Until then, from all of us here in Berwick-Upon-Tweed, goodbye.